Israel advocacy is respond to the questions that people are asked over and over again that are really not sincere questions or sincere points. They're not the points made are not historically valid. They presume something to be true, which is taught ideologically, and we find ourselves unprepared to teach it. Last night, I talked about the problem, the so-called stealing of the land. It's something that I haven't responded to forcefully because I don't want to be bellicose. I don't want to feel that I did delegitimizing other people, but they declared war. They massacred over 1,000 Israelis in the most atrocious brutality imaginable. And it's time to bring our rhetoric up to the level that there's a war on, a tragic war on, where the enemy took over a little part for a day of the state of Israel in order to massacre and take captives. It's in their documentation. It's also in the documentation that they intended to hold for a few days. If they had held on to a few days, it would not have been 1,000 Israelis massacred. It would have been in the thousands. There would not have been a few hundred Israelis taken captive. It would have been also perhaps in the thousands. This was a raid. By the way, when Hamas invaded on October 7th, they put a call out to Israeli Arabs to rise up in revolt, to Palestinians on the West Bank to rise up in revolt, for other Arab countries round about to attack. Now, nobody answered the call. The intent was to destroy Israel. And by taking over a small section of Israel for a few days, they thought that would, in the imagination of Israel's of the states round about, that Israel's militarily weak, and for a day Israel was militarily weak, or I'll say for a few hours, that would encourage others to attack what they thought was a hollowed out state. And by the way, one reason Hamas thought that Israel had become a hollowed out state was because of the internal strife in Israel, where there were loud voices in the state of Israel. Israel was an illegitimate state, that it was a fascist state. People called for Israelis not to serve in the army and not to go to the reserves. Israel has never appeared as weak as it appeared because of what I consider a protest movement actually founded in no reality. Netanyahu is not a fascist. The judicial reforms weren't creating fascism. It was a rhetorically charged protest using outlandish rhetoric, fascism and Nazism, in order to topple the Netanyahu government. I understand that it's a democracy. You want to topple a government democratically. My opinion. Don't use it through Lashon Hara. Don't use it over the top language. Don't call on people not to serve in the army. Don't tell reservists not to show up to duty. Don't convince people to resign from reserve duty as they try to train Israeli Air Force pilots. I was against that. I'm not pro-Netanyahu. I'm not pro-Likud government. I'm against people telling Israelis not to serve in the army. I'm against using over-the-top rhetoric that is not rooted in any reality. If anybody wants to challenge me on that, I'm happy to create a session and walk you through the evidence. What effect did it have? And this is now being documented, that Israel appeared weak and therefore susceptible to an attack that would hold on for a few days, the understanding be that the Israeli military had been demoralized and weakened, and if the Hamas could hold on for a few days, the other Arab states would then attack. Again, this is an opinion of mine, rooted in some evidence, and if you have a different opinion, examine the evidence and, of course, come to your own conclusions. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying it's an opinion rooted on evidence. Now, so the idea that, as I mentioned last time, that Jews stole the land is rooted in the idea that the land was actually owned by a people called the Palestinians. I want to propose this. It's called disputed land, and to grant the idea that it is owned by a people that didn't exist until 1900, a land that is disputed. It was owned by the Judeans, owned as it were, controlled by the Romans, by the Eastern Roman, the Byzantines, then by the Arabs, then by the Turks, then by the British. There's never been a Palestinian state that owned the land. Ask anybody, who was the first Palestinian president? What was the Palestinian parliament? Was there any evidence of Palestinian control of the land until the UN gave a part of the land, assigned a part of the land to the Palestinian Arabs as they assigned part of the land to the Palestinian Jews in 1948, 47, 48. As you know, the other side declined the partition and went to war instead. So I want everybody to memorize this as you talk to anybody. It's not Palestinian land from whom it could be stolen. It was disputed land. The Jews agreed to the partition because they didn't want to engage in a war to take over the entire land. From the Jewish perspective, it's the ancient Jewish land of Israel. It belongs to the Jewish people. I've never said that before. I don't want to sound bellicose. I don't want to sound right-wing. It is valid from the examination of Jewish sources. It's just as much entirely Jewish as the other side said, it's entirely Palestinian. Remember, that's their claim. It's all theirs. And if there is any kind of peace, it's because they've ceded land to the Jews. From a Jewish religious perspective, it's all belongs to the people of Israel, and we can cede land for the purposes of peace. Since the other side is not ceding any land and wants to destroy the Jews, I recommend that at least theoretically, you don't have to believe this deeply, but at least theoretically, it belongs to the people of Israel, and we are very willing to cede land in the interest of peace. It can't be stolen from somebody who doesn't own it. It's disputed. Now, when do we see this throughout the history? You'll see in the War of 1948, there was an attempt by the Arab Liberation Army, mostly populated by local Palestinians and the 5 Arab nations roundabout who invaded. There was an attempt to exterminate, eradicate the state of Israel and massacre its people. There's good evidence that massacres were intended. There was no recognition of the UN partition in 1947-48 that the Jews had any right to the land. The so-called 1967 borders are armistice lines of 1949. Israel signed an armistice with Lebanon, with Syria, with Jordan, I believe with Iraq, with Egypt. And by the way, if you go look online for the armistice agreements, you'll see that each one of them, the other side said, the ceasefire, this armistice, does not mean the war is over. It's a cessation of hostilities. The right to continue to prosecute the war is not taken away. The 1949 armistice lines are ceasefire lines that the other side understood as the starting place for continued war against Israel. The evidence of this is in 1967, remember, when Egypt massed its forces on the southern border of Israel, promising to invade Israel, destroy Israel, and again, massacre its people. So remember, on the other side, there's no recognition that Israel, as it were, owns its land. Israel was understood to be an illegitimate state. The Jews were there illegitimately, hence the idea of imperialism and colonialism, and therefore the ideas that Jews stole land. I want us to memorize this. It's disputed land. There's a Palestinian claim of the entire land. I believe, for rhetorical purposes, we can say, well, one could say that the Israelites claimed the entire land, and so that we don't have war with each other, let's come to some kind of a treaty. It's not stolen land, it's disputed land. If anybody wants to point out in particular, this was stolen, this was stolen, this was stolen, I've looked up all the evidence. There was a war in 1948 over land. So it was a war, not thievery. If Israel had lost that war, no one would say that the other side stole the land from the Jews. They would say the Jews lost the war. By the same token, Israel did not steal land, they won a war. What you hear is a rhetorical attempt to turn their declaring war on Israel into an ideological victory. Using the term stolen land is an attempt to take a military defeat into an ideological victory. I don't recommend we grant that ideological victory. I think we should say disputed land. Therefore, you can see my point for today, the occupation. How can Israel be occupying land that does not belong to the other side? There never was a Palestinian state. They had the opportunity to create a Palestinian state in 1948 when Jordan controlled the West Bank. and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. They chose not to because their goal was to eradicate the Jewish state. In the War of 1967, when Israel, by the way, to the surprise of all, including the Israelis, were able to dislodge the Jordanians from the West Bank. And remember, by the way, Jordan was part of the British Mandate of Palestine. The proper name for Jordan would be Palestine across the Jordan, or East Palestine. The fact that they named it Jordan doesn't mean it was not part of the Palestinian Mandate. When the state of Israel moves into the West Bank, many Israelis, particularly on what we'll call the religious right, said, we've come back to our homeland. This is the land of Israel. It never belonged to them. They never granted Israel the right to exist. So you can't, theoretically, you can't both say to Israel, you have no right to exist, but we have a right to exist in disputed land. So when Israel went into the land, remember, from 1967 to 1977, Israel offered peace. There was no intention to occupy the land, even though a good case could be made that it's disputed land, which, from the Israeli perspective, over which we have now taken control. It's disputed land. We fought about it in 1948. We were not able to take all of our disputed land. You retained some, but Jordan launched attacks on Israel, further perpetuating the idea that Israel is a illegitimate state. Jordan joined in a war for the eradication of Israel, as did the Syrians. Israel pushed back and took over disputed land. And again, I never thought I'd talk this way, but we need to talk this way because we can't grant this argument to those who want to destroy Israel. Israel in 1967 took control of disputed land and then said, for the sake of peace, even though we've won a second war against you, we'll give you this land for peace. They rejected it. Why did they reject it? Because they wanted all of it. You can't occupy a land that you own, especially when you now own it, not just theoretically from the biblical perspective, which again is not a point of view that I'm comfortable with, but I'll share it with you. Now it's actually politically controlled. As much as land is owned by enemy, it's those who are military politically in charge of the land. Look, across world history, when we say own a land under dispute, and I'm sorry to say this so bluntly and in such a realpolitik way, when a land is under dispute, it's eventually owned by those who establish control in the land. If you look at the long history of human migration, of war over land, all across human history, how do people own land? Because they win a war. This is realpolitik. I remember back when I was a student at USC and Israel still had the Sinai Peninsula, and someone said, Israeli took the Sinai from Egypt. I said to them, well, how did the Egyptians control Sinai? When did it become Egyptian? Person looked at me and said, what do you mean? I said, well, it didn't. When the earth was formed, it didn't have the stamp Egypt named on it. When did Sinai become part of the political entity called Egypt? Now, the person understood my question. Land does not ontologically inherently belong to anybody, in my opinion. Land changes ownership through warfare, through migration, and therefore the reason Egypt can claim the Sinai, it was, as it were, politically granted over centuries and nobody else wanted it. Remember, when Sadat said the word peace, the Sinai Desert was returned to Egyptian control, not that there was a mass exodus from Egyptians to live in the Sinai Desert. So when you think of occupation, don't grant the term. Israelites have moved into the land of Israel, traditional land of Israel, and some have chosen to settle there. They're not colonist settlers. They are part of the original people who were displaced by the Romans, displaced under Arab times, and now returning to their land. So there are no, as it were, foreign colonist settlers. It's Israelites who are redressing a grievance. Now, I want you to know that since the 1967 war, one government after all in Israel was willing to talk and settle this. There were very few settlements under Menachem Begin. They didn't want to go too far with it because they thought eventually there's going to be a peace treaty. So you look at most of the original settlements under Begin, they were areas, number one, that had been taken away conquered and people massacred and settlements destroyed in the 1948 war. They were contiguous with what we call the armistice lines of 1949. There was just an attempt to make the state of Israel more defensible and take back settlements that were destroyed in 1948. Once the other side rejected any of this, the settlement program began. Now, I was in the peace camp in those days. I was against settlements. I said, why antagonize these people? What people said to me is, they're not granting peace. They're not granting this existence of Israel. Why should we grant them that is their land when it's disputed land? Now, I had arguments on the other side. I would argue with the settlers. Now I understood their point. Now I understand their point more deeply. When they say occupation, they mean the entire land. When Hamas says the occupation, they don't mean of the West Bank. They mean Haifa. They mean Tel Aviv. They mean Holon, Rishon LeZion, Petach Tikva. They mean everything. So therefore, if we grant the idea of occupation, we play into the radical Islamic theology of it is all occupied land. And as I saw on an Al Jazeera chronology, one lie after another delegitimizing the state of Israel, their conclusion was the state of Israel must be dismantled and all the Jews must leave. Right? There's a war on. If somebody believes that, if anybody believes that, and they want to say free Palestine, I recommend you say, go to Palestine. Go to Hamas. Join Hamas. Live up to your words. Go to Iran. Convert to Islam. Become a Shiite. Join the Revolutionary Guard. Train yourself to massacre innocent people. Because free Palestine means murder Jews. You want to murder Jews? Go over there and murder Jews, and let's face ourselves on the face of battle. Don't be a slacker and walk around a university in the United States saying free Palestine. That's slacker. That's slacktivism. You really mean it? Go fight. I want you to know. Our daughter asked us, do you want me to come home? We said, Abigail, we said, sweetie, it depends on how you feel. She said, no, I need to stay. I need to be here. As you know, our daughter Shulamit was with us. Like many Israelis across the world, she flew home to take her position. If anybody says free Palestine, encourage them to go and be a person of their word. Why do they stay here and say free Palestine? Because they want to delegitimize the state of Israel to the point that in 10, 20, 30 years, the delegitimation of Israel has become a fact in American politics, and that will be very dangerous for the state of Israel. The state of Israel's survival requires that these ideas like occupation and stealing the land, that we argue against these ideas, and that people of the United States understand that this is verbal chicanery with no rooted in reality. It's an attempt to delegitimize the state of Israel. Now, occupation. Remember, since Israel has been in the West Bank, there's been one attempt over another to pull out of the West Bank. We're going to have a link put up in just a moment into the chat on the Oslo Accords. If you read the Oslo Accords and you look at the government of Yitzhak Rabin, who was dedicated to ending the Israel-Palestinian conflict by giving the Palestinians, from the Israeli perspective, a viable state. Rabin went as far as to promise the Syrians that Israel would return to the armistice lines of 1948, an untenable border where the Golan Heights are looking over the Galilee and were constantly subjected to Syrian bombardment all the way through 1967, to cede that back to the Syrians and go back to what they call the June 4th, 1967 lines. The deal was this close to being signed by Yitzhak Rabin in 1994, if I'm not mistaken. You can look it up in the Oslo Accords that we're going to put in the chat. All Rabin wanted was this: listening posts in the Golan so that we could detect if there is an invasion of Syrian tank forces on their way to Israel. That's all Rabin wanted. The Syrians refused. Under the Oslo Accords, there was a movement to cede more and more land under Palestinian control. If you look in the Oslo Accords, it's a gradation of Israeli withdrawal. Area A, B, and C, you can look up all the details. Yitzhak Rabin, as you know, was assassinated by an Israeli, I'll say, radical, on the radical right, who did not want Israel to cede land. And at the same time that Rabin was assassinated, Hamas began terrorist attacks. Now, here's the tragedy. Rabin being assassinated might have scuppered the deal entirely. But Hamas attacking and murdering Israeli civilians when Rabin was this close to getting a deal, subsequent to the Oslo Accords, that set the deal back. Well, who became prime minister in 1996? Does anybody know? Benjamin Netanyahu. And people say he's right-wing, he was against a peace deal. But Netanyahu, now go look this up, the Y Accords, W-Y-E. Netanyahu was trying to get a peace deal with Yasser Arafat and get Oslo back on track. This was Benjamin Netanyahu, the fascist, the racist, the Nazi that people call. It disgusts me to have to repeat these words. He attempted to get it back on track. The terrorist attacks continued, and Netanyahu's government fell because Netanyahu was seeking peace. Now, you would have thought on the other side, they would have thought, well, if we can make peace with Netanyahu, this is going to be a real peace. They rejected the overtures of Benjamin Netanyahu. It would have been a great start for any peace. Ehud Barak came into power, and he wanted to go further and further for Israel to cede land for peace. So when you say occupation, I want you to think about it. Israel was constantly trying to come into an accord with the Palestinians to cede as much land as is reasonably possible for peace. Israel was staying there for security in order to withdraw. Now, what happened in 2000 that brought down Ehud Barak was the Second Intifada was continuing, and finally, again, I might have my dates exactly right, but a terrorist attack on a civilian structure on the beach in Tel Aviv that has stood in ruins from the time, I believe it was 2000, all the way up until recently, I mean for 20 years, called the Dolphinarium. You could go inside and see dolphins swim in a big pool. It was a big hangout for Israeli youth. There was a terrorist attack. If I'm not mistaken, up to 100 Israeli young people were massacred. I might have my number a little bit wrong. But I remember myself. I was in the peace camp. I was part of Peace Now. I was in that kind of leftist group that says we have to make peace, we have to make peace, we have to come to court. I remember that. I remember my wife and I arguing about it in the early part of our marriage. And then the Dolphinarium was attacked. And young people were massacred. This brought down the Barak government, and there was, you might say, the people in Israel felt as if there had been a strike to the solar plexus. Wait a minute. You actually don't want peace. You don't want to withdraw. Hamas terrorists were inhabiting the West Bank under the eyes of Arafat. Hamas terrorists were in Gaza under the eyes of, by the way, it was occupied by Israel. And their desire was to destroy any attempt at peace by massacring Israeli civilians. You can look this up. I believe this happened around the year 2000. That's when Barak government fell. Ariel Sharon came into power. Why did Sharon come into power? Because Israelis felt vulnerable. Who's going to stop the constant terrorist attacks carried out by Hamas, I believe Islamic Jihad, and Al-Fatah, Yasser Arafat's group? Many people here don't even remember these events from 2000. Those of you do, I want you to recall them. It wasn't about occupation. Israel was trying to get out of the West Bank. It wasn't about occupation. Israel was trying to get out of Gaza. As Israel tried to get out, the terrorist attacks increased. Why would terrorist attacks increase while Israel's trying to get out of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? Ask yourselves. Why did the terror increase? Because the radical rejectionists led by Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and parts of al-Fatah, did not want peace. They were terrified of peace, that if a peace deal would be signed, they would have been made irrelevant. Israel was trying to get out. The attacks continued. Ariel Sharon came into power. Why? Because he said, I won't let this happen anymore. Sharon led Israel back into the West Bank to track down terror cells that were murdering Israelis. Now, if you look at the Al Jazeera chronology, it's as if out of nowhere, Israel did not want to stop an occupation. It's just not true. If you look at Oslo Accords, the Y Accords, where Netanyahu tried to get peace. Look at the Camp David Accords under President Clinton, great detail. With Ehud Barak, there was great attempt. In fact, I remember when I read about the Camp David Accords, the negotiations were down to negotiating city blocks. That's how close there was to a peace deal under Camp David and the Mitchell Plan. Okay, look up Camp David, look up Mitchell Plan toward the end of President Clinton's time in office. It was this close. Israel wanted out. Israel did not want, they were willing to give up all the settlements. They were willing to give up the Golan Heights. They were willing to pull everything back for peace. Why did Sharon go back in? Because of unrelenting terrorism. The rejectionists got what they wanted. There does not have seemed to have been enough popular support on the West Bank to get rid of Hamas. They were tolerated. Many people believe that Arafat said one thing, did another. He would pretend to negotiate for peace and then say, I can't control Hamas. I don't believe it. Might have been true. I began to really feel for myself disheartened, brokenhearted, that the people with whom I used to argue, meaning the people not in what I call the peace camp, that they were right. There's no one there to talk to, not who mean it enough to get rid of Hamas on the West Bank, to get rid of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and to stop the terrorism. Ariel Sharon went back in to stop terrorism, and since that time, when there's no evidence that terrorist cells on the West Bank would stop, Israel could not allow the Palestinian state to continue. Now, what did that mean? It meant a state that was entirely contiguous. Israel realized they have to have border checks, I'll say border checks, out from one Palestinian area to another Palestinian area to make sure that terrorist goods were not being transported from one place to another. So people look at the kind of broken up configure of Area A, meaning the area under Palestinian Authority. By Area A, I believe is Palestinian Authority. Area B is Palestinian Civil Authority, Israeli Military Authority, and Area C is area still under Israeli Civil Authority. Israel wanted to expand Area A, but they couldn't allow contiguous land because of the transfer of terrorist goods up and down the West Bank. That's why the map looks like it does. Not out of an Israeli desire to occupy, but rather out of an Israeli desire to stop terrorism. You remember that Al-Tulkarm in Judean hills, there was constant sniping attacks down onto Israeli cities on the other side of the so-called Green Line. Israel built a wall to stop sniping. They built borders to stop infiltration. What does the other side say? Apartheid wall. It drives me crazy. They want their own country. They want borders. Israel builds a wall that seems to be suggesting a border, and they call it apartheid. Don't they want their own state? Don't they want to live apart from Israel? But notice the rhetorical chicanery that when Israel builds a wall against sniper fire, it's called an apartheid wall. And at college campuses across the country, they throw out the word apartheid wall, apartheid. And our children, our grandchildren, swallow this poison voluntarily. And it corrupts and poisons their moral compass and corrupts and poisons their understanding of any history because of these rhetorical tricks. Last night I spoke extensively about the complete baselessness of the idea of apartheid but it's a meme that has stuck because they want to say just as the South African state, which actually was racist apartheid, was an illegitimate state, so is Israel. There's no reality to it. We come up to the present. After a while, the Israeli settler movement said the following. And again, I was heartbroken to hear it because my roots are in the peace camp. I was heartbroken to hear they said, they don't mean peace. Why are we withholding settling in our land? Because they keep dangling peace in a completely insincere way, because they dangle peace and then they murder Israelis. They dangle peace and murder Israelis. The settlers said, why are you stopping us from going back to our homeland? It's not their land. It's our land. I didn't like that rhetoric. I didn't have an answer. Now, I've been to the West Bank. I want to share with you, and I've studied this carefully. As I've gone through the West Bank, you'll see a completely desolate area with an Israeli settlement. You can identify it by the architecture immediately. You go around a curve, there's an Arab village. You go around a curve, there's an Israeli settlement. You go around a curve, there's an Arab village. The Israeli settlements were not built on Arab villages. Now, you might find one or two places where that happened, so I can't be encyclopedic in my knowledge. But there's no evidence under the Turks, under the British, under the Israeli control of the West Bank, that any government, Turkish, British, or Israeli, has gone into an area, raised a populated Arab village, and put a settlement instead. I'll remind you last night what did happen. During the 1948 war, in March of 1948, before Israel was established, the Haganah was losing the war. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I need to put this point here. The Haganah was losing the war, which means the state of Israel might have been crushed in 1948 because the Israeli Haganah, proto-Israeli self-defense, headed by Ben-Gurion, they had a concept of only fighting in self-defense, while the enemy was fighting an aggressive war to destroy Israeli settlements, as you will see in the destruction of Gush Etzion during the spring of 1948. There was another side of the Haganah who said, we have to take the war to the enemy. We can't sit here and wait for them to attack. We have to go on the offensive. That was in April 1948. And that decision of the Haganah to go on the offensive saved Israel and set up what happened next, because now the Arab Liberation Army, which was the indigenous Palestinian Arabs, officered by the Syrians, etc., they began to lose battles because Israelis, the proto-Israelis, took the battle to them. When the war broke out in 1948, remember, it was the Arab Liberation Army High Command, the Arab High Command, the AHC, that ordered local Palestinians to evacuate so that when they invaded, they would not be on the field of battle. Okay? That's how the Palestinian refugee crisis began. In addition, there are some villages where Israel called peace and the residents did not call peace. They weren't massacred, they were evacuated. You want to have war against Israel? Go to the part of Palestine that was given to Palestinians. Yes, some Arab villages were evacuated. True, in times of war. Was the other side doing the same thing? Almost, except they massacred. If you look at Gush Etzion. Were there small level massacres on both sides? Yes. Read Benny Morris on the Israeli War of Independence or Palestine Civil War. Yes, Israel. There were Israelis that said, "You massacre us, we'll massacre you." Okay, meaning you want to fight war Middle East style, we will fight war Middle East style. By the way, it was actually when you look at the bitterness of the conflict, the killing of innocents on both sides was actually very small relative to the nature of the conflict. Benny Morris is called the revisionist Israeli historian, not identifying with the good Israel so-called story, so-called narrative, but he wrote a book to expose moral failures in the Haganah, in the Israeli army of the 1948 war. It was vilified by I'll say, pro-Israel Zionists. I read Benny Morris's book. I compared the Benny Morris book to what I'll call the heroic Zionist story. I read it and I said to myself, with heartbreak, it was a war. I wish it weren't that way. But those who said on the Israeli side, you massacre us, we'll massacre some of you. Why did the refugee crisis continue? because they were afraid of the Israelis. Not because Israelis pushed them out. They left before the Israelis get there. Why? Because there had been word of Israelis and Palestinians massacring each other. Again, I want to put it in context. Relatively very small numbers, not more than a few thousand by each side. How Israel won the 1948 war, I'll talk about another time. Now, we'll go to Gaza, the so-called occupation of Gaza. Remember, under the pressure from the Bush administration, Sharon was pressured to evacuate completely from Gaza to cede all military control over Gaza. So the idea that Israel somehow occupied Gaza, made an outdoor prison, this is just a ridiculous piece of rhetorical chicanery. Israel pulled out of Gaza. They had an election. Fatah won the election. But I remember when Israel pulled out of Gaza, I thought, well, here it is. The time to establish the shining city on the hill. Gaza, which had, seacoast, rich in fisheries. The willingness of the international community to pour billions of dollars into Gaza. What happened as soon as the Israelis pulled out? Rockets were fired. Why? Because Israel gave up control. Israel wanted out. Israel did not want to military control Gaza. Rockets were fired. Israel would appeal to the nations, would appeal to the UN. You got to get them to stop. We don't want to do this. What happens in 2007? Hamas takes over the Gaza. No argument from anybody. Imposing a radical Islamic theology on the inhabitants of Gaza, contrary to every value of what I'll call the political left. But now it used to confuse me. Why would the political left support a regime dedicated to tyranny, no regard for women's rights, how much the more so any what we would call LGBT rights today, no regard for this, murdering people? Why would the American political left support them? I realize there's two left. There's a political left that stands for what I call, the focus on civil rights, and there's the radical ideological left that has no regard for civil rights. It's rooted in anti-Americanism, anti-West, anti-democracy, and in particular, anti-Israel. So I will never say anymore the left. I'll say the political left, which I admire. I have deep roots in the political left. And what I'll call the radical ideological so-called left, that is only an ideology of murder. It's an ideology of hatred. I don't think you can point to one positive accomplishment of the radical left. It's only rooted in destruction. That has taken over our many colleges and universities. It's gone down into the high schools. It's a poisonous. It's acidic to what it does to the moral compass of a human being, and we have to push back there. So if anybody says occupation, I want you to look up the Oslo Accords, look up at all the Israeli attempts to get out of the West Bank, to get out of Gaza. Why is Israel still in the West Bank? Because of the Intifada, because of terrorism, and because the settlers finally said, why are we sitting here when we'll never have peace? What did they do? They moved into empty areas, not wanting to interfere with the cultural life of local Arab villages. Why hasn't Israel granted Area A status to more of the West Bank? To combat terrorism, not to occupy, to combat terrorism. Now, we're left to this terrible place today where I believe strongly most Israelis would like to get out of most of the West Bank, as Rabin wanted to, as Netanyahu wanted to in the Y Accord, W-Y-E, if you want to look it up. But they aren't able to, because as Israel tries to pull back, terrorists on the other side grab Israel by the lapels. Israel trying to pull back and smack him in the face and say, the more you try to pull back, the more you hit you. You think you want to have peace when you pull out? We're going to blow up a Passover Seder. We're going to attack a bus. We're going to attack an elementary school and massacre kids. We're going to set bombs off in Tel Aviv. We're going to set bombs off in Beersheba. It's not about the West Bank. It's not about Gaza. It's about the entire land of Israel. What Hamas has been able to do is pull up off another amazing feat of rhetorical chicanery and talk about an outdoor prison. Somebody mentioned it last night. And, just thinking from linguistic theory, if there's something called an outdoor prison, it must be a concept that here's the concept, here's the example. Has there ever been in the world this idea of an outdoor prison? Never. The concept doesn't exist. It was invented to mislead people. Okay? Now, I just read an article, LA Times this morning, as I prepared for today. Front page of the LA Times in my digital edition, a former resident of Gaza is bemoaning. Here's what he said, he or she. The thriving marketplaces, the coffee shops of Gaza are now destroyed. He didn't say the outdoor prison of Gaza was destroyed. He described the idyllic life of marketplaces, shops, and coffee shops. Think Westwood. Think Melrose. He said, it's now destroyed. And of course, I felt bad for him. And then I thought to myself, you brought on a war you should never have been brought on. You, Los Angeles, former resident of Gaza, did you protest the Hamas government? Did you in any way try to convince the people of Gaza not to permit an attack on Israel and massacre 1,000 people? Did you ever protest the constant rock attacks on Israel that are happening today? I'm not going to. I want to write this person. What did you do for peace? Did you do nothing? Or did you secretly advocate for the destruction of the state of Israel, for the building of rockets, for the launching of rockets, not for Israel to pull out of Gaza, because Israel had already pulled out of Gaza. Why did they do it? Number one, to make sure that a peace deal could never be signed, and eventually destroy the state of Israel with the support of Iran and other rejectionist groups in the area. There is no outdoor prison. Occupation is a result of Palestinian intransigence, not Israeli will. Yes, there is a settler movement, a small number of Israelis, politically maybe 10-15% of the population by their representation in the Knesset. And their point is, why shouldn't we settle in empty land? Because they don't want a peace deal anyway. Mirav and I have been to some of their houses. They make their case to us. And by the way, we sat in a house of a settlement about 15 years old. Beautiful place, by the way. I mean, just clean, just really a beautiful place to live. And he pointed across, he said, there's the Arab village. We have very good relationships with them. And I said, just by looking across the ravine, I said, it looks pretty nice. He says, it is pretty nice. When we moved here, they built our city. We hired them. They came over with us and built our settlement. I said, why would they do that? He said, it's in their economic interest. We bring wealth to this area. There are now the Israeli version of Costco called Rami Levy. It's in the West Bank. I've gone there because my son used to live in a settlement just north of Jerusalem. It was half Arab. It was Bedouins, Jews, Israeli Arabs, Palestinians, all shopping at the Israeli Costco. Why is there an Israeli Costco there? Because Israel's settlements are dotting what was uninhabited land, hiring local Palestinians to build it that created wealth in them, and then building an infrastructure that has benefited everybody. If you go to, and I want to challenge you, go to a settlement and say, what's that over there? Well, that's the local Arab village. We have good relationships with them. Drive with them over there and see if you can sit in a coffee shop and say, what do you people want? Do you want to destroy and massacre those people over there? If they say yes, you have your answer. If they say, well, theoretically, they shouldn't be here, but on the other hand, ever since they came here, our population has grown, our standard of living has grown, we have commerce in the area that we would have never had because of the settlers. You know, for many people, you say the word settler, they break out into a rash. You go there. And again, this is not someone who began on that side. I'm watching the effect of settlers in uninhabited areas of the West Bank. It has produced population growth. It has produced prosperity. Now, I'm not saying that if a peace deal, a true peace deal when they were in the offing, that Israel ought not dismantle some of these settlements. It'd be heartbreaking to see what happens to these people and perhaps resettled in the Negev. If a true peace deal would offer, the majority of Israelis would take it. The only reason there are settlers in the West Bank, in uninhabited regions who are producing wealth for the West Bank, let's be factual here. You can look it up. Look it up, the population growth of the West Bank since 1967. Look at any prosperity in the West Bank. Look at the villages that have enjoyed prosperity. Israel will be willing to give almost all of that up in return for peace. So when you hear the word occupation, think Palestinian recalcitrance and rejectionism of a peace deal that would actually create a Palestinian state. Occupation is caused by Palestinian recalcitrance and rejectionism. Israel does not want to be there. There are some Israelis that want to be there. Israel would force them to relocate if true peace were in the offing. Why did Hamas go out on a terrorist rampage right as Camp David was getting ready to be closed, both Oslo and the Y Accords and Camp David? Because they don't want peace. They want the destruction of the entire state of Israel. So I'm encouraging to you, you hear someone say, steal land, it never belonged to you. Palestinian people, right? I would never have said this before. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I don't want to sound bellicose. There was no Palestinian people. It's an invention. Take the DNA of Palestinian people. It's immigrants from Egypt, from Syria, from Algeria, from Lebanon. And anyone that are actually Arab, let's say someone can track their DNA back to Arabia, what is that evidence of? It's evidence of invasion, imperialism, and colonialism that goes back to the late 600s. I'm not granting that argument anymore. If someone says stolen land, I'll say disputed land. If someone says Palestinian people, I'm going to say, where did the Palestinian people come from? Because if you're going to go back 2,000 years, then you're Jewish. Tell me exactly. Go back to the demographic Ottoman Empire. Look at the population by the way, of Gaza was half Jewish during the Ottoman Empire. Go back to the West Bank. It was very sparsely populated. When did the population grow? When the settlers, when Zionism began and when the British began. It's a complex history. It's not taught fairly anywhere. Everything I'm saying can be found online. But the university have taken one narrative, created an anti-Israel narrative, and our students, our children and grandchildren, who we send to American schools, they're forced to take classes that are not informed what I will call by the political left, which is the amelioration of living conditions, but by the hard left that wants to destroy the state of Israel, starting by illegitimizing Israel. Now, as I understand, bombs are now falling on Tel Aviv. Bombs are falling on our children. Now, meaning, if you know our daughter Shuli and Abigail, they're being bombed right now. Meirav's family in Holon and Rishon LeZion, they're being bombed right now. It's very hard for me to stay online and talk to you. And why are they being bombed? Because Hamas has been allowed to exist and thrive with Iranian support because of this radical ideological left that has taken over the UN and captured enough of the world's attention that they can proclaim blockade and outdoor prison the whole time they're arming themselves to the teeth with enough armament to invade Israel for a day and massacre 1,000 people. Where those trucks came from, where those RPGs came from, where these are rockets coming from, is not evidence of a blockade or an outdoor prison. Okay? We in the West have been mesmerized by what in Israel is called hakonsepsia, meaning the concept that peace is in the offing. This has been destructive of the state of Israel, that peace is in the offing. That's why there was a youth festival just a few kilometers outside of Gaza. It was unthinkable to those few thousand people who were celebrating a few miles outside of Gaza, that Gaza would attack and massacre people, would burn corpses, would mutilate people, would rape women next to the corpse of their friend. It did not occur to them because of hakonsepsia, the concept that peace is in the offing. We lived under it here too, as did I. Accord with Saudi Arabia, things are looking good. Hamas said, okay, we're going to have 17,000 workers go into the land of Israel. You know what many of them were doing? As they went into Israeli settlements, they were mapping it out. They were mapping out Israeli settlements. Hamas knew exactly where to go into every settlement they attacked. They had detailed maps created by workers from Gaza that were given permits out of empathy for Israel to have income into the Gaza Strip. Israel increased the number to 17,000 a day, if I'm not mistaken. And they were, of course, many of these workers, I'm not saying all, many, were collaborationists with Hamas. The conception is over. The conception which has taken over the imagination of the West, the imagination of, I think most American Jews, the imagination of the American left for sure, is, as it were, unwittingly collaborating with the radical left. With a radical left that wants to destroy Israel. Hence my talks today. I don't know how many more of these talks I want to do. We need to get back to the new normal. This Wednesday, I will be offering a course. You'll all know about it, detailing all this in an organized manner, especially for college students, high school students, their parents and grandparents, for you to know exactly what you can do to dismantle the ideological takeover of the humanities and social sciences in our universities, colleges, and high schools. I'll be doing that Wednesday night. So my prayer for all of us here, my heart is broken. My heart is broken for the atrocities. My heart is broken that Israel is at war once again. And my heart broken truly that the Palestinian cause for a Palestinian state has been hijacked by terrorists who want murder. I still envision a day when there might be, probably not in my lifetime, but hopefully in the lifetime of our children, that there will be a thriving, prosperous Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state where there can be Israeli Arabs living in the land of Israel, and there will be Jews living in Palestine, that the populations will live side by side in peace. I want it. I don't know if I believe it anymore, but I want it. And the tragedy for me is something that appeared close in the 1990s was destroyed by Hamas, not by Israel, by Hamas. One reason Hamas attacked now, by the way, many people agree, because Israel was close to normalization with Saudi Arabia, because of the proposed highway from India through Saudi Arabia through Israel. There was an ongoing attempt to normalize the Middle East. That's one main reason, perhaps the main reason Hamas went to war, was to completely dismantle any attempt for peace in the Middle East and prosperity in the Middle East. My hope is that after this war is over, minimally, that can get back on track, because this evil force called Hamas will have been defeated and eradicated, and perhaps peace in the Middle East will actually be possible.